Well, good afternoon to you and welcome to this Sustainable Land Use session. So earlier on this afternoon we talked about nature-based credits. Now we'll talk a bit broader around sustainable land. Firstly, human beings are essentially land-based animals. Okay? We live on the land predominantly. We feed off the land and our freshwater supply is almost exclusively from land. So we rely very much on land as a resource. But secondly also, we are animals, meaning that we live in a natural ecosystem with plants, with other animals. And our relationship between us and land is what we'll talk about this afternoon. For today, we've got a very esteemed panel that we will have later. But firstly, we will start with Iqbal. Iqbal is the Global Executive Director for the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL. He will do a short presentation about what they're doing around poverty alleviation, particularly around sustainable land use and small farmers. And after that, then we'll break into a panel discussion with that. So with that, I'll pass it to Iqbal to do his presentation for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for rejoining. I think we lost a few people, but hopefully it's not. Exactly, it's a more cozy audience, and hopefully it's not correlated to this presentation, the absence. Okay, so thank you very much for having me, and thanks to all of you who are donors for all the work that you do in funding a lot of the work, very important work that happens. Thanks to all of you who are implementing partners, whether it's foundation, whether it's NGOs or government partners who do such important work in the field, innovating around new ideas and implementing them. So what's my angle at it? So I work at JPAL, which is a center which was started at MIT's economics department and now has offices in about a dozen countries and projects in about 60 countries around the world. So the angle that we bring in as JPAL is not as implementers, it's not as funders, but is as knowledge partners, as evaluation partners, as partners who work with both the donors as well as the implementation partners to try and understand which of these interventions work well, which ones don't work so well, and why some work better than the others, what are the lessons from that, and what are the generalizable things that can help increase the impact of your work if you are an implementing partner, and the impact of your dollars if you are a donor. All right. So with that, let me dive in. So today's topic is sustainable land use. It's sustainable land use is often mentioned in climate economics as a wicked problem. And the reason why it's called a wicked problem is because of two aspects. Let me start with aspect number one. The first is because food production contributes to climate change and biodiversity loss. I think all of you are aware of this, but let me just give you some stark numbers. 23% of greenhouse emissions come from agriculture or forestry or related emissions. So that's a big chunk. Now, what is different is that unlike greenhouse emissions which come from transportation or from manufacturing or from producing energy, we don't have enough technological solutions. A lot of the discussion, for instance, in the fossil fuel industry is why can't we have a faster transition to solar or to renewables? Whereas, so it's something about we don't have enough money, but we have a solution. Whereas I think what is different here is that I think we are also needing far more solutions, and there's a dearth of sometimes the solutions. The third problem is that the course that we are hurtling on is really, really unsustainable. There are estimates that by 2050, if we stay unchanged, the way the human population is growing and our patterns of food consumption are changing, you would need the land size of two Indias to be cleared for agriculture in the world to still provide the people what they want. And we will need the land size of the entire continental United States to be deforested to provide us the extra wood and lumber which is needed for the upgrades and the houses and everything that needs. And clearly, planet Earth just cannot sustain that. So first part of the wicked problem, the way we are thinking about agriculture, forestry, land use is completely unsustainable. But here's what makes it super difficult. What makes it a really wicked problem is that, in turn, these systems, these really critical food systems, you can ask somebody, okay, you need to fly less, you need to put your air conditioner less. But here we are talking about food, the most essential human need. And that particular human need itself is being threatened by climate change. It's being threatened by climate change because of floods. It's by the increased salinity. It is being threatened by rainfall, which is far less predictable than before. And the biggest impact of this is being suffered not by the 500-acre farmers in India, but in the U.S., but by the 1-2 acre marginal farmers in Africa and in Indonesia and in India. And so the impact of this climate change on the food system is actually being suffered by the most vulnerable of the people. So this is why this is such a wicked problem and one that we really need to solve. Now, here's what makes it more complicated. That so many times we have been in the search for these so-called silver bullet solutions in this field. Here's one example for you. A few years ago, you will remember how, a few years is relative when you have more gray hair like me, but about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there was so much conversation about ethanol produced from sugar, ethanol produced from corn, and how this is going to be like a silver bullet for us. And why would it be a silver bullet? Well, number one, it means less exploitation of fossil fuels. And number two, it means that the farmers are going to benefit rather than the big oil companies. And then look what happened to that. Like now there are studies which says that US corn-based ethanol has higher greenhouse emissions in the process of converting the land into corn use, and then the actual production process of producing ethanol produces more greenhouse gases than burning gasoline itself. Here's the second silver bullet. This happened during the Clinton, the tail end of the Clinton administration, where these clean cook stoves were again like everybody was on the clean cook stove bandwagon. And again, they were like, oh, this is fantastic because number one, it reduces deforestation. And number two, it's great for health because the indoor pollutants are reduced. So it's a win-win for everybody. And then lo and behold, look at the Guardian article now, which says that the carbon offset were overstated by 1,000%. Here's a final example, and this is one that yesterday, for some of you who were attending, the Singapore president as well as the CEO of Temasek talked about carbon markets. Carbon markets are, which are literally everywhere people have tried to introduce carbon markets. They are beset by inconsistencies, severe price up and down movements, which are really discouraging the people from adopting carbon markets. Okay, so I think the point that I'm trying to make with that silver bullets, and now I'm not going to go through these, but I just listed some of these examples to tell you that, in a sense, we have a dearth of solutions, but we also have an excess of solutions. Like if you ask somebody what are the ways to mitigate carbon, they'll give you a bunch of these, and these are just for the sustainable land use. And this is, by the way, just mitigation. If I added adaptation to that, there'll be another list of it. And the only reason I stopped writing more on this slide is because there's no space. But I think the point is there is no dearth of seemingly good solutions. So the question that arises, whether you're an implementation organization or the question that arises if you're a donor, is how do I choose between these solutions, whether to fund or to scale up? So do I base my choices on some of the things on the left? So let me, I'm going to switch to one example, which is of payment for eco-services, which essentially means you pay farmers, for instance, not to burn their the waste crop. You pay farmers not to, cut down the forest abutting their farmland. So, there can be payment for many things, but that's what I mean by payment for eco-services or ecosystem services. So, I can't tell you how many times I have gone and talked about these things to people, and they will base their answers on this. Instincts. First instinct, paying people money to do the right thing never works, and therefore PES is not going to work. Ideology. Why in the world should I pay somebody to do what's the right thing? This is morally wrong to pay people to do the right thing. There'll be people who'll be like, based on inertia, oh, we don't do that. We have never done payment for eco-services, so therefore we're not going to do it. And then this search for silver bullets. Oh, you're just asking me to do, pay a little bit money here, a little bit here. How much benefit will happen if you prevent 100,000, 10,000 farmers from not burning their crop? What I really want is to invest in this, my state-of-the-art university, which is going to produce this beautiful machine, which is going to just suck the carbon from the air, and voila, we'll all live happily ever after. So, I'm just trying to make it a little funny, but it's really sad when you go to people with evidence and then you hit those four things. So the main premise that I want to encourage all of you to think about is that instead of relying on these things, can we instead base the programs and the choices that we make on understanding what is the local context, and then bringing in the global knowledge of what works in designing interventions and designing innovations. And a lot of this is happening. I'm not saying that this is something conventionally beautiful that I'm telling you about, but there is still so much money, so much effort being made by governments, funders, and others where this is not happening. And then use the same rigorous randomized evaluations or impact evaluations that we trust. We trust the same RCTs for every vaccine for COVID that we got, for every vaccine that our children got for smallpox or diphtheria or polio. They were all subjected to RCTs. Every single medicine we pop in our pop every single day went through that RCT trial. Can we use impact evaluations whenever those are relevant? I'm not saying do it all the time, far from it, but wherever possible, can we use rigorous evidence to test what is the intended impact, measure their cost effectiveness? This is, by the way, the second thing, right? We often measure impact. We don't measure the cost effectiveness of interventions. And number three, while we are piloting these things, understand how they need to be scaled up. Okay, so enough of theory. Let me take you to an actual example. I could have substituted stubble burning in India to the fires that happen in Indonesia. I remember a few years ago I came here and the plane could not land in Singapore, and they were hovering around because there was like so much smog in Singapore from fires that were burning in Indonesia. So it's kind of a consistent problem, but I'm pulling this example because we actually have done something about it. So stubble burning is on the rise. It damages the air quality, very, very obvious. It has impact on people's health. But it's actually equally bad for the climate. It's equally bad for the soil and for biodiversity of these farms. But still, it's happening, and globally, it has increased by 55% since 1960. And in India, where we did it, if you look at those numbers, it's stark. Since 2011, so in just 13 years, stubble burning has increased by 75%, which is kind of ridiculously high numbers to see. It's a major source of black carbon. 40% of winter pollution in Delhi is caused by it. Like if you ever go to Delhi between November and January, it's really engulfs you. Coming back to the different solutions, here are like 4 different ones. Again, I just cherry picked them because all 4 of these, I helped work on one of these evaluations, and these were the main 4 that we were discussing with the government. First was informing, educating farmers on its environmental health. This is like the first instinct of governments, right? The farmers must be these people who don't understand stuff. Let's just give them some education and voila, life will be better. What it assumes is that the farmers don't already understand that this is not the best thing to do, but they don't have any other choice. So that's kind of the first one. The second one is the other thing that governments often rely on, a command and control structure. I shall command everybody, you cannot burn your stubble, and if you burn your stubble, I shall send 3 inspectors to your field and they will fine you and take you to jail. Sorry, it doesn't work that way because you have something called corruption where, it just turns into the fact that these poor farmers end up having to pay bribes to still burn those fires. The fourth is, let's buy this heavy equipment, happy seeders, stubble burners, but who's going to afford the rent on this? Who's going to pay the rent for this? Where is this capital going to come? And all that happens is that a bunch of rich people get richer by buying this heavy equipment and kind of nothing happens. So then the final one in this mix is the cash incentive for not burning. This is your payment for eco-services. And this is kind of how the whole thing got designed. So this is a state in India called Punjab. It's responsible for most of the stubble burning. So we worked with the government of Punjab and said, let's implement a randomized evaluation in the field and let's do figure this out. So in an RCT, you always have a control group. This is the group where life goes on as usual. You don't do anything, but you just observe them to see how their life stays. So they are the baseline against whom you are comparing how your intervention changes. Now here's where the fun part starts. So to 310 farmers, we offered them $10 an acre for not burning their farm, but this is a standard PES contract. And by a standard PES contract, I mean that they get paid this $10 at the end of the season if they don't burn their crop. So that's the standard contract. And then within that, right, there was this question, is $10 enough? Should we be $20? So we said, okay, let's try both of them. Some farmers get $10, some get $20, and let's compare and see, does their behavior change based on that? But this is where we then tried something a little different, which is PES with upfront payments. So we said, let's try, what happens if we go to the farmers and tell them, you know what, we trust you, and we know you will do the right thing, and maybe you have a capital constraint, you don't have enough money to hire the agricultural labor to do the, pull the crop out, and therefore you put the fire because you don't have the money to hire those people. So why don't we give you 25% payment upfront? And to another group, we said, let's give the 50% payment upfront, but we are actually giving them the lower payment. So if you see, nobody's getting 1,600 rupees, so we are actually giving them the lower amount. We're just removing your credit constraint. Let's see what happened. So the standard contract with payments at the end of the season had no effect on burning. So you tell people, I will give you 800 rupees, I will give you 1,600 rupees, makes no difference. But look what happened when you gave them upfront payments. It reduced crop burning by 12 percentage points. That's a big number, here's the government trying, and this is just one season, first time tried out, there is, all of these things kind of improve over time, and the cost per life saved was about $3,600 to $5,400, and you think about that, even in its first year, it's a really, really cost-effective way. If somebody told you that your loved one's life can be saved by paying $3,600, imagine how many of us would say this is such a great deal. Reducing burning had no adverse effect on crop yields. This is kind of really fun, right? To see that the farmers were able to change their practice to one which is sustainable land use with no impact on their crop yields. So they were as productive as before, and now we are, of course, developing a cheaper, more scalable model. The government's changed. We asked them to scale it up. It didn't happen. Similar stuff is happening on different things. This is Seema Jayachandran, another professor in our network. She's based at Princeton. This is a photo of farmers cutting down the forest in the Amazon or in Uganda in this particular case. She did a similar study in 2016 in Uganda, found that PES contracts decreased forest clearing by half. In 2023, she took the same work to Mexico and found that full enrollment, which means enroll your entire land, not just the land which abuts the forest, quadruples the cost effectiveness of your work. And now we are actually working with the government of Brazil on designing one of the largest PES programs called Bolsa Verde, which will encourage farmers by transferring money to not cut down the Amazon. So kind of this is at the heart of what we have done all around the world. Today I've been talking about climate and agriculture, but we work around the world. We have done about 2,400 studies. Each of those dots represents one of those studies in any sector around the world. And then I just put this slide in for some of you who I'm sure would have either heard or will hear about, RCT as a methodology. Why do we need to do rigorous evaluations? They can be expensive. This is our founders, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, along with our affiliate, Michael Kramer, receiving the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economics for exactly how you take randomized controlled trials and take them to the field and apply them to understand basic things like exact answering these questions. Will farmers respond to payment for eco-services? How effective it is, how cost effective it is. I just want to end by giving you 4 examples of how philanthropists have used evidence in their decision making. So this is an example with King Philanthropies. They're based in California. They gave us a fairly large grant to fill the gaps in the knowledge in climate science. So for instance, do demi-loons work? What is the best rain harvesting technology for Africa? What will encourage farmers to use stress-tolerant crops? So we funded 37 projects around the world, specifically chosen where implementing partners told us that they would like to see evidence happen. The work has already scaled up to 41 million people. Here's another example, Community Jameel, which is a member of the Philanthropy Alliance. They have funded us to set up what we call embedded air and water labs within governments. So, work within governments to help them solution some of these problems and test them and then scale up some clean air and water solutions. There is a third one, which is OCP, one of the biggest fertilizer manufacturers in the world, and they are doing exactly what the air and water labs, but for the private sector and for sub-Saharan Africa. How do you increase small-scale farmers' food security, productivity, and profitability? And then the final example is for some of you who sat through my plenary talk yesterday. I gave you this example of this emission trading scheme in Gujarat, where voluntary carbon trading is now happening. So I won't go through the whole thing because I already gave you the details yesterday. But 12 million people have been reached in Surat and Ahmedabad, and now it's going to be scaled up in the entire state of Gujarat. And that trading scheme has led to a 20 to 30% decrease in pollution, and that was funded by and Vedis Foundation is helping us scale this up. So I just want to end by saying that, I hope through these examples and others, you see that, we've been talking at PAA about the partnership between philanthropists, between the private sector, the public sector. But I hope that you can also, I was able to convince you that bringing in hard science and some of the researchers into that mix can actually really increase the impact of your dollars and the impact of your work. Thank you very much for your attention. No, I should stay.
Thank you very much, Iqbal. I would like Iqbal to stay on stage. He's part of our panel. And I welcome our panel on stage. So let me stand up here. So Gisela, Bernard, Dr. Sanjayan, and Iqbal.
Great talk.
Thank you. So let me start with a quick introduction. So Gisela is from the Jollibee Group Foundation, based in Philippines. So welcome. Bernard is actually based in Singapore, but he's part of the Sinamas group, and they recently established a new philanthropic organization in Singapore called Golden Philanthropies. So congratulations on that setup.
Thank you.
Dr. Sajayan is visiting us from the US, and the CEO of Conservation International, one of the leading conservation non-profits around the world. And obviously, Iqbal, you have seen the presentation, so I won't introduce him again. So firstly, from the PA, I'm Donald. I'm the programs lead for the Philanthropy Asia Alliance. Yesterday, we announced, in fact, 3 communities. These communities consist of clusters of members who have come together to actually make and drive change around collective impact and collective funding. One of those committees involve sustainable land use, particularly 2 aspects of it. Firstly, small farmers, which is the predominant form of agriculture throughout Southeast Asia, but also South Asia. And secondly, around conservation of forests, in particular tropical forests, which are very important for this region and also for the global climate agenda. So those, the 2 pioneers, in fact, of that community is on stage here. So Sinamas as well as Jollibee. So thank you very much for leading this effort. And we also welcome other members as well as other partners to join us for this community. So our first question, let's talk a bit about the projects which are being done right now, particularly the localized projects in Philippines, for example. Gisela, maybe you can touch a bit about what are you doing first?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying on and listening to this panel.
So Jollibee Group is the largest Asian food company in Asia. And as a food company, our mission in the foundation is to help Filipino families have access to food, especially vulnerable communities. And because poverty is highest in the rural areas, we have to work with farmers. After all, there's no food industry if there are no farmers. So in this context then, when we talk about food security, we're really looking at income security for the smallholder farmers. We have joined hands with the company to facilitate the inclusion of smallholder farmers in our supply chain. And this is done through direct procurement arrangement, not contract farming. This means farmers who are accredited by the company can bid to supply the company, provided that they meet the volume, quality, and timing requirements and standards. Over the last 15 years, about 30 farmer cooperatives have supplied the company, and we source last year around 30% of our vegetable requirements from them. This stable market that has been provided to the farmers has allowed them to repay their debts, secure back the assets that they have pawned as collaterals, and have the resources to invest in the education as well as on other assets. However, to get to that point, from having smallholder farmers marketing individually to a collective group of farmers selling to institutional buyers, we had to develop an approach that would equip them with the skills to do enterprise management and collective marketing. So we call this the 8-step agro-enterprise clustering approach, which teaches the farmers how to organize themselves into production clusters, how to do product consolidation and scale operations, and how to organize the required logistics and post-harvest facilities to ensure that quality is met. This approach we bundled with access to market, financing, and agri-technologies that are delivered through a network of partners on the ground, local government units, microfinance institutions, and the academe. And these partners are actually linked also to national and international agencies for additional resources and expertise. So for example, we work with the IBM, the Weather Channel, to provide on a daily basis weather forecast, localized weather forecast to the farmers via SMS so that they can plan when to apply the inputs that they need. We work with the commercial bank to offer a loan product, which is now realized because an impact loan, because they were able to get 3% per annum by paying promptly, and which is seldom seen or never been seen in the country, but which the commercial bank is very happy about, and now they're planning to make it a regular loan offering. We also work with Netherlands-based organization to establish a soil management program for the farmers who previously have not even had soil analysis services done on their land. This approach that we have been doing, we have been receiving numerous requests to teach others how to do it, including the Department of Agriculture. And we have now converted it into a training program so that more institutions can learn the approach, train more farmers, and in the process allow us now to get more farmers organized for collective marketing, allowing us to scale up and help more. Thank you.
So thank you. I've actually been to one of the farms in Rizal, and it's very impressive. But one thing the farmers said is the certainty of income. If I grow something, I can sell it. So that gives them a lot of certainty when they grow it. Now the price obviously is subject to the market conditions, but at least that gives them more certainty. It also gives certainty for the microfinances, right, because they know as long as the product is produced, there will be a buyer for it, and that guarantees an income. Maybe pass it to Bernard on Indonesia.
Yeah, thank you very much, Donald. And thank you all for joining us for this session. I thought I'll first start with two plugs. First, obviously, for the community of interest that have been formed. Obviously, Gisella's a partner for us. I think it's a fabulous thing that we gather like-minded people together in communities, because individually we have ideas for philanthropy, but collectively I think we'll be able to not only curate those ideas in a better way, but also to scale them, which is far more important to have impact. So that's the first plug I have. The second thing is, if you do have time, please do spend some time when you walk out the door to look at the project that YIKAN has. So Yayasan Konservasi Antara Nusantara is actually a TNC project that we do together with Temasek Foundation as well as the UBS Optimus Foundation to actually restore mangroves. So I invite you all to have a look at that as one of the projects that we do. But I thought for my presentation, I'll tell you a little bit of a story of how I got involved in a project that we have done and has scaled since. And this really resonates with the presentation that Iqbal gave. So in 2015, Indonesia suffered its worst bout of fires. I think about 2.3 million hectares, and if you can just imagine that size of forest actually burnt. And that was when probably Iqbal was circling in the air.
That's exactly the year.
Yes. And couldn't land.
Yeah.
And as a group, we have 7 lines of business, but the business of forestry as well as plantations suffered as well. We lost a lot of hectares of standing stock. The source of the fires generally came, he's called it stubble burning, but basically it's land clearing. And it was during that time where fires started to invade into planted areas, cultivated areas, and there's nothing you could do to stop because of the extreme dryness of the weather. So we started to realize our future and the community's future and their habits are actually one. It's part of the same ecosystem. And we started a project then of trying to work with communities to move away from non-sustainable forms of cultivation or just non-sustainable behavior. If you exploit nature, by cutting gathering resources on sustainability, you're going to run into projects or problems like this. So one of the clear things we needed to do was to work with villages and to get them to move and change their behavior to much more sustainable forms of agriculture that doesn't rely on endless exploitation of the resource that's currently available and may not be in the future. And secondly, basically to not use fires at all. And the way we did it was to actually engage each individual village by providing them a fund. And this fund is used to promote sustainable forms of agriculture. It's actually done in a way that gives choice to the villagers. So someone may want to do a vegetable farm that doesn't exploit that's you don't need to use fires. Some people want to do, may say, goat farming, right? And we leave those choices, but the 3 criteria we have is number 1, it's got to not involve fires and not involve any form of unsustainable agriculture. Number 2, it's got to have no impact on the forest cover. So the area that you use, no impact on forest cover. And lastly, obviously, it has to lead to a rise in income. This project, we put that fund there. People draw from the village. They use that. And then when they are able to, they repay the village. That fund is actually owned by the village. So if you don't repay, you're actually depriving someone else from using that same fund. And that model seems to work for us. And we've done this very successfully. I won't say every village is successful, but over time, we've expanded the program that it's almost touched 500 villages. This program we call Desa Makmur Peduli Api, right? But basically, it touches every village that we think are a risk, and we try to raise that income. Obviously, it's been ongoing for about 8 years. We have some data. By measuring whether people are better off, we're quite clear that just crude measures like has income risen is just one, has income been distributed is another one, right? Do people feel more connected to protecting nature is a third. So we're looking at various measures in which we can judge whether that project is something that we can continually improve. But certainly this is one of those big things that we are doing in terms of trying to get and reconcile good land use in nature.
So maybe I'll bring it to Dr. Sanjayan more around conservation, particularly the scaling of conservation. I guess from I was also in a non-profit before that. Every forest, in terms of the economic value, comes in cutting it down, right? The wood that you cut to turn it to furniture, every process, and there's right now no economic value attached to preserving a forest. So how do you then encourage or address this issue? But right at this present moment, there's no real economic financial value other than cutting down the forest. How do you then encourage conservation, and what are the solutions involved in encouraging conservation? So, yeah.
Thank you, Donald. Great question. And I really, very much agree with what, sort of Bernard laid out as a model for really getting communities to think, differently about their future and influencing that. I'm looking at the title of this panel, and it's about the role of philanthropy to drive action, right, in terms of land use. So I don't think philanthropy can actually drive it. I think philanthropy can open doors or provide new models, but you need something a bit more scalable than philanthropy. And just relying on philanthropy alone is just never going to get you to the scale that you need to get to deal with the real issues, where land use is a massive contributor to many of the challenges that we face today. On forests, I think that equation that standing forests aren't valuable is changing. And it's changing very rapidly. It's probably one of the most encouraging things that I have seen, in my time in conservation, is I think your statement would be absolutely true, 10 years ago. I'm not sure it's true today. So there are many more mechanisms now to recognize countries that have standing forests, mostly public sector funding that helps do that. And then in restoration, I think there is a real economy that is scaling and driving money into the restoration economy much steeper, much more than I would have ever imagined through philanthropy. So I can give you like a concrete example that we work on. So we partner with BTG Pactual, which is an investment bank out of Latin America. I think they're the biggest investment bank in the Americas. And what they do through their Timberland investment group is they basically buy previously deforested land. So this is very degraded land that they can get for very, very cheap because their productivity is extremely low, and almost no one works on those lands. It's like, I think, 1 person per square kilometer because it's just such low value. And then they restore it with our help, restore half of it to native forests that are left intact for essentially forever, and the other half goes into some kind of certified timber production, usually for things that have long shelf lives, like furniture, for example. And with BTG, obviously they're the financial firm, not Conservation International, but they are promising their investors return that is market return, right? A competitive market return. And they've been able to raise about $500 million already, and on their way to raising a $4 billion for this fund. Now, if you told me you're going to be putting $1 billion into restoration and you have to go raise that money philanthropically, it would be an almost impossible task to do. So you're seeing a lot more mechanisms out there today that are return seeking, that are looking at restoration, looking at standing forests, some extent carbon markets as well in the voluntary space. So I'm quite encouraged by that. I don't know if it's going fast enough, but I'm quite encouraged by that. I just want to make one quick little other comment, in terms of, the real challenge that we have in terms of really moving land use. So for most farmers, they're constrained by really 2 things, and these are small-scale farmers that we're talking about, mostly in the Global South. One is, to your point, they don't have access to capital. So they definitely know a better way of doing it. But there's no way they can leave half their field fallow in order to do the new system and then make up the money on the other end. So the access to capital is quite a dramatic thing that I didn't realize that so many farmers just don't have that access to that. And the second thing is they don't have certainty of the marketplace itself. So the supply chain isn't there, or they are not able to produce in a consistent enough manner to meet supply chains that, let's say Jollibee needs. Or the bigger companies need. So you almost have 2 sides of this. Everyone's trying to do the right thing. Really, I actually think big companies are trying to do the right thing. Small-scale farmers are trying to do the right thing. But putting it together is a very, very hard problem. Coffee is probably the best commodity that exemplifies this actual challenge.
And Iqbal, I guess, one of the things that also struck me after visiting Rizal was that the first challenge for small farmers is obviously income. Second was climate change. They actually mentioned that climate change, because the weather gets hotter every day, they can't farm during the day, they can't do crop management during the day, they have to do it in the evening. And obviously with typhoons, the Philippines is probably the most exposed country from climate change. So how does that equation actually, both the impact of climate, but also the solutioning around small farmers and getting them also to increase yields as well as address nature positive outcomes?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. So I think there are lots of solutions which can and are known to work. I think the question is, how do you get them into the farmers' hands and how do you support them to adopt them? So the first is, of course, drought-resistant seeds, right? Like, in a sense, the technology exists, and yet farmers are still stuck with some of the non-drought-resistant varieties. Part of it is because they reuse the seeds that are coming from this thing. There's a little bit of distrust. What will happen to my yields? What will happen to my productivity? We've got to give them the confidence, whether it is through extension farms or through kind of guaranteeing them that, okay, you can still retain your seed from previous year, but why don't you try a little bit of that? So I think there's a part of that which is, essentially what Ujala tries to also do, the work we are doing in Sub-Saharan Africa, to get these technologies to them. I think, Sanjay mentioned this earlier, issues like crop insurance and there are financial tools which exist, very low quality financial tools. And the world is getting better at transferring money to people through electronic means. And so I think better access to financial tools, whether it is crop insurance, flood insurance, insurance related to this, and then having the government subsidize this is, I think, extremely valuable. We are seeing, part of the reason, for instance, in India, farmers want these minimum support prices is because this other ecosystem of social security protection and nets is not there. So I think that is very important. The third is, I think, technology. There are some common goods that only governments or large tech companies can provide, but somebody has to kind of band it all together. So the example here is early warning for floods, early warning for heat waves, early warning that this is going to be a year when you can expect the monsoons in India not to be only 40%. But it's not enough to tell on the television that, the monsoon is going to be 40% deficit in South Asia this year. What do you do about it? What are the actions? What are the tools that you need to do? How do you get money ahead of time into the social security accounts of these people to kind of hardy them to it? So the good thing is that a lot of these things, I'm generally skeptical about technology as a silver bullet. The world is full of things like one laptop per child and other things which, where technology is hyped. But I think the current hype is a lot around AI. But I think where AI does have potential is to free the constraints of frontline frontline workers, whether it is your nurses, doctors, and most importantly in this case, agricultural extension workers. Agricultural extension workers, a good agricultural extension worker is one of the most scarce commodity, and their time is a very scarce commodity because they have to travel from one farm to the other, and especially you add hilly areas and terrains, and it's a problem. And AI has the ability now through dump calling back into a number to release those constraints, to customize the messages that go on about your farmer, about your farm, about farming practices, about the early warning and the threats that are coming to it. So I think there is a lot of ecosystem of things that are coming together. We just need to make sure that these tools are available to the farmers, but before that, to folks like Bernard and to the Jollibee Foundation, we need to make sure that this entire ecosystem is made available to them so that they can kind of then transmit it further.
And the other thing was about visiting the farmers, that they actually have these Facebook communities, and essentially they share pricing of their products on these Facebooks. So it need not be AI, it could be just very simple information flow through very simple, well-used existing platforms as well. By the way, if anyone has any questions, we will put up the slide on to scan, and you can put in any questions through that, or you can raise your hand also if you have any questions on that. But maybe coming to Gisela and also Bernard, there's a question around the role of purchasing organizations. Particularly in your case, you purchase directly from farmers. How can purchasing organizations at a local level, and then Dr. Sanjay can talk about purchasing organizations at a global level, what role do they have actually in driving this change in farming techniques, et cetera?
Yeah. As you mentioned, the power of having stable income that allows the farmers to now project how much will I earn if I plant this much. That is a kind of scenario that not many typical farmers would have. They will rely on the pricing, on what the traders will bring to them at the field level. So what we're doing now, when we started doing this, of course, they were supplying to the company. But as we teach the approach, we're realizing that they could actually use it also to generate support from the local markets. So we have a local government unit who found a market for peanut. And peanut actually is imported from the Philippines import peanut for its pastries, when in fact it can be grown locally. So I'd like to believe that in the end, it's really, the market is not the issue. It's really getting the farmers organized to do collective marketing. And if they are at that stage, then the market will naturally move to them. Because, of course, for a company, having the freshest quality supply direct from the field is always the best proposition. But the challenge really is how to get that off the ground.
There's actually very little for me to add. Gisela has probably summarized it quite clearly. In my interactions with people in the farms, all they want is a price. And it's quite amazing to me. Things like a commodity like chili prices can actually fluctuate quite severely, depending on the season and whatever. And many of you are nodding their heads down there. So again, for a chili farmer, right, he absolutely has no idea what the price is. We are obviously not a food company like Jollibee is, but certainly we do try to see whether we can have a price floor organized like what Gisela has mentioned, the sale, and obviously sometimes to bypass the intermediary, which sometimes tends to take away the margin from the farmers. So we've done this in a number of areas, but certainly for many of the farmers, the local conditions are the critical part, and the solutions to find is actually quite local. But I'd like to hear what Dr. Sanjay
on the global basis, what are the roles of global purchasing organizations?
I'm not a commodity trader, as much as I'd like to be. So take something like, so the place where we've really worked on this is coffee is a good one to look at. So coffee is extremely susceptible to climate change, because you can only grow it between 1,500 and 3,000 meters. So it's very narrow band that it can grow. It's nearly always being grown in very biodiverse and carbon-rich environments. So, mountaintops, tropical systems, so it's highly threatened in that way. And it's under a lot of threat from changing temperatures and changing climate and lack of land as well. So we've worked very hard to try to transform coffee farmers into being more, sensitive to, better growing practices. And one of the big partners we work with is Starbucks, for example. So if you take Starbucks, they get coffee from about 450,000, basically 500,000 farmers grow coffee for Starbucks. And that's in like 30 countries plus, which is an amazing number of farmers. And all those farms are under 20 acres. Somewhere between 10 and 20 acres. So small farm plots that are growing for this giant company. And if in order to be able to sell to Starbucks, there's a standard that Starbucks has established called the Cafe Practices. Now others have adopted it as well, but it's quite a high standard. Like you can't cut a tree. You're not allowed to cut a tree down if you're going to grow coffee for Starbucks. You have to send your kid to school, if they're under the age of 18 or something like this. So there are these sort of tracking standards that Starbucks applies throughout the place. But the real challenge that the farmer has is now that climate change is happening, and we know the challenges these farmers have, we want them to use different varieties of coffee to grow. We want them to be able to grow more climate-resistant varieties, for example, or ones that use less water, for example. But the transition is not possible for them. Because if you have 20 acres, and you're trying to, convert it, what are you going to do for the 5-6 years while you're waiting for that plant to grow? And you can't use half of your field to do that because you're just not making enough money on the other end. And it's kind of a mind-boggling thing to me that kind of financing is not available. So you have collective being able to supply to a very large company or groups of companies, right? So that side of it is sort of there. But there's nothing available for them to make that transition. So that's the area that sort of we're really leaning in, where we're using both private and public funding to create a pool of funds, a little bit like what you're doing, but at real scale, so several hundred million, and and making that available to farmers with return, and just dealing with the risk using mostly philanthropic money or subsidized money to deal with the risk, but then investors who put money in are expecting a return in the long run.
It's interesting, if I just may pick that up. On our end, however, is the question of availability of those technologies. What can farmers actually do to do low carbon farming, to do transition to sustainable agriculture? Because we could also mobilize that kind of PAS in a way. But we're not into agronomy. We don't have those technologies. So this is, for me, very enlightening to be able to understand all the different possible innovations, but to do that in a way that's going to be affordable and accessible to the smallholder farmers. Because the tendency, for example, is it's all digital smart agriculture is all nice and fun, but sometimes it gets to the hands of only the bigger players among the community farmers. So then you further heighten the inequity in terms of access to technology. So for us, we're willing to make those investments on how to convert those technologies in a way that will really make it very affordable, because they're making money from selling to an institutional buyer. But the availability and transforming that technology to something that's really workable for smallholder farmers, we're on it, and we're very interested.
And Stella, the trick on this is that you can't make it specific to the company.
Yes.
So the challenge is, if you take say to a company, a particular company, like, in order, can you put up some funding? Can you put up some capital that's return seeking in order to help specific farmers, help your supply chain? Most of them will do that. But supply chains don't really work that way. So farmers who grow coffee for Starbucks also grow coffee for others. Right? So it's not I'm just picking on Starbucks as just an example, but it's just a good example of that. Like, there's not a lot of incentive for Starbucks to put up their capital, frankly, because everyone else is going to benefit from their thing. So you have to get to them by actually saying it in a different way. You should say to them, like, how about if we can promise you 10% return on your investment? Because Starbucks sits on some amount of money. They're not putting it all back into their business. They're investing in all sorts of things. Like, they're investing in the stock market. Many companies have money that they invest in lots of ways, but it's a completely different department that deals with it. It's their treasury, basically, right? They don't just keep it in the bank. But you got to get the treasury to sort of work on that, because it's not just going to benefit them. And that's actually just a little difficult right now.
Well, I've built a B2C company before. I can tell you that changing people's behavior is tough. Changing small farmers' behavior, who have done it for 40 years, is even more difficult.
Right.
So maybe to Iqbal, actually, how...
I think there was a question.
Sorry, there's a question here. Sorry. Yeah, actually, we should put out a QR code up there.
Well, we are such a small group, I think. Raising hands,
feel free to ask a question, please.
I think Gisela won't be surprised when she hears my question. So, during the Green Revolution, there were a number of institutes set up in the global south, including here in the Philippines. There's a forestry center in Indonesia. And the goal of these organizations was to solve for a lot of the things you're talking about. They had new seed technology. They trained agricultural extension workers. They worked with small farmers. And they've been around for 50 years. So why do you think, what's the hypothesis from the group as to why these organizations that were originally set up to deal with these same issues that you're talking about have not cracked up the code?
Can I start?
Yes.
Because IRA is in the Philippines. The thing is, the CGIAR agencies actually work with the national research institutions. And national research institutions now deal with, in our case, local government units, because extension work has been devolved to the local government units. And when that happened in 1990, then that somehow affected the whole professionalization of the agri-extension work. many mayors are not interested in agriculture extension because, you know, that's not as sexy. Yeah. Plus, the other thing is, all this time, I think the whole notion of agro-enterprise development is fairly recent in the literature when it comes to extension work. The notion has always been on productivity, on improving yield, and all of that. Now you have to couple it with agro-enterprise. Now you have to couple in sustainable land use. So there's a whole new field that's emerging that an extension worker at the community level will now have to get his mind around, and I'd like the idea of that, how to use AI so that those kinds of information are at their fingertips and even at the farmer's own fingertips. So,
maybe
yeah,
just
I
give the money.
completely agree with that. If I have to add,
Yeah.
you know, like from a civil service perspective, which I used to be in a long time ago, you know, like the entire motivation of the agricultural extension worker is to see high productivity. He gets they get questioned on that. And how do you raise productivity? Oh, you know, like dump water, dump fertilizer, like dump chemical fertilizer, this, that. You know, like basically people react to the incentives that are provided to them. The agricultural extension workers, the whole system that was set up in the 60s was to raise productivity. And how do you raise productivity? Throw inputs into that. Nobody has you need to reset their mission to say sustainable agriculture, sustainable climate use, farmers' income, to Giselle's point, is as much a part of you know, your outcome. And then you have to empower them to kind of do this, like you know, like the same thing that we were talking about. What should they go to the farmer with? Are they going to them with, you know, these financial tools? Are they going to get them with technology tools? So I think we'll have to rethink the entire agriculture extension worker model for them to respond to the climate change things, which has not happened.
I mean, one example is rice, for example. You know, rice obviously is a large methane. So we do have a pilot project within PAA where we're reducing methane while increasing yield and reducing water. And often it's just the knowledge of the farmer that actually don't need to use so much fertilizer. And by just not using enough fertilizer, they can actually increase income by 20%, right? And not impact yield at all, probably increase yield. So these are just simple knowledge farming techniques, which are often quite hard because, like I mentioned, changing behavior is actually quite difficult for a farmer who's used to that. But then when you convert it actually into an outcome in terms of increased income, and this has got nothing to do with the market at all. This is just purely using less materials, less inputs as well. So there are these things, I think, which are quite important, but it comes back, I guess, to the question that I wanted to raise actually, is about how do you actually make people change? Right? How do you make the small farmers, you know, incentivize them? Is it like Obama should just give them cash, right? Is that a very simple methodology which may run into certain ideological instinct questions? You know, what is the most effective way actually to enabling, you know, the change, given that we know we're dealing with a person who has an entrenched behavior for maybe 30, 40 years? You know, so.
I think the first thing I will ask you is ask them. Don't presume what they want, ask them, right? Like the example that I gave you from the standard contract versus the other contract. It's not the amount of money. They did not change their behavior with twice the money. They changed the behavior with half the money because the problem is their cash, they have a credit constraint.
Right.
You know, the reason they are not using sustainable ways to pull out the paddy and instead they're burning the stubble is because actually partly because of the climate change, the seasons have compressed. The time between harvesting paddy and sowing wheat has compressed. You need to do it quickly, and if you don't do it quickly enough, then there is a problem. So how do you do it quickly? You need to hire more labor. There is not enough labor in those places, and the price of the labor gets really distorted at that time. So you need to say, what is it that is driving that behavior? What is driving that behavior is the lack of money, the lack of labor. You've got to solve that. So yeah, like it sounds very bad to say, you know, should we give them cash? But yes, at that point, cash is what they need, and cash is what you need to provide them. But at other points of time, you know, it's not cash. It can be education, it can be access to the technology, it can be access to markets. And so I think the answer is very context specific. But the biggest problem, you know, my founders, Abhijit and Esther, wrote this book called Poor Economics. You know, and I'll just give you this one quick example. They find that, you know, like all the public distribution system is meant to sending people grain and rice and paddy. And then they find that, you poor people, why do they sell part of that grain? Because they also want to go once in a while and go to the sweet shop and buy some sweets for their children. So it's not as if, the farmers are, these poor people, they get 10 kilograms of rice and they sell away 1 kilogram in the market because they want to buy whiskey or, buy 6 cigarettes. Because they want to sometimes buy these nice things that all of us care about. But the entire system is predicated on somebody in the capital city deciding that what is good for this poor person is to send them 10 kilograms of grain. So don't presume, ask the people, and you'll get the answers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And just to add, you mentioned that this is a wicked problem. And when we talk about wicked problems, the solution cannot just be a technical solution. It requires adaptive change on their part and understanding what is keeping them from adopting certain behaviors is key. And that's why I really appreciate what you mentioned about understanding the inner logic. Because otherwise, have in all the discourse on sustainable agriculture, people are asking, how do we make it profitable for the impact investor? But have we asked, how do we make it profitable for the smallholder farmer? I don't think that's actually being asked as much. And yet, in fact, they're the key if we really want to promote sustainability.
I wanted to tell a story just to relate to this idea of consulting the people on the ground. So, when we were tackling this problem about fire use, in clearing the stubble, the idea was obviously to give them machines, right? And then you gave the machines, and then the farmer goes, but what about the bugs? And I go, what bugs? He says, well, if we don't burn the field, the bugs will still remain there. This machine ain't going to remove the bugs. And so the problem becomes a little bit more complex because you think you know the solution, but actually you don't even know the problem. Right?
And then what is the role of philanthropy in this, right? We talked a bit about the corporates, about the splashing like the Starbucks, but where can philanthropy be that catalyst? Because, coming to the scene, Amaz, you set up the Golden Philanthropies. Yeah. Where do you think philanthropy can play this role in catalyzing it?
So first of all, I want to just thank Donald for giving that plug for the Golden Philanthropies. So Cinemas established the Golden Philanthropies precisely to actually put and be catalytic in terms of climate action. So we'll be very focused on actually using the funds that we have just to advance, in the area of climate action. I think philanthropy is important in two ways, and we're starting to learn this all. First, it needs to be catalytic in exploring new ideas. I think the worst way to use it is you keep putting money to sustain a current idea. But if you can put money, changes behavior, scales the entire project, I think then it will have a lasting impact. And that's perhaps the function. Like what Dr. Sanjaya was suggesting, that if you could also pull in other forms of money from the government, from the private sector, so that you actually use philanthropic money to reduce hurdle rates and to reduce the risk, that again is a very big function that you can scale a lot more funds to actually address a particular problem. And I think we can do this in a whole series of ways. One of the key things we're trying to look at is a very innovative way to actually tackle some of the problems of transition. So, Dr. Sanjay was saying that you wanted to move farmers from one type of crop to another type of crop, but then 5 years, he will have no harvest. How do you fund that transition? And if we could do that in a whole range of ideas, I'll give you another example, right? In Singapore, I think the MES just published a paper on transition finance for coal-fired power plants. We know that a lot of the world's coal-fired power plants continues to have a life, the average life was supposed to be 2040. And if we allow these coal-fired power plants to continue to 2040, we have no hell and chance of keeping below 2 degrees. So it's quite clear we'll have to retire them early. But what's the incentive to do that, right? So again, transition finance to actually allow the incentive. We're hoping the carbon markets will help to actually produce some of that financing, right? To actually incentivize and allow the early retirement of these coal-fired power plants, I think is tremendously important. So to me, I think philanthropy comes in to try to address areas where we currently find it difficult to address, and to actually have that push to try to get us in the right direction.
Dr. Sanchayan, any new models of
No, I
how
mean, I
philanthropy can
completely
help?
agree. I mean, I think everyone here, you know, whether they're folks on the giving end or folks to some extent on the receiving end, would agree that the role of philanthropy is to drive innovation, to de-risk projects, to take. But it's really not how most people see philanthropy. Even though many of the philanthropists in the world have made their money on very risky things. They've made big bets on all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's sort of in the nature of making money. You're going to have to do that. But when it comes to their giving, they tend to be very conservative. I just think it's literally two parts of your brain. You know, you can sort of see the risk in one end and you can't do it the other end. But I think you really need to figure out ways to encourage that.
Yeah.
And you know, some of the things that we've done, which have been massively game-changing in the long run, would never have got off with any other kind of money. I mean, you're talking about land use. I'll tell you this little story. So in southern Africa, a lot of the land use is driven by ranching, basically nomadic or semi-nomadic, local, sometimes indigenous communities that have cattle. And if you go to South Africa as a good example, you know, the national parks there attract the richest of tourists. You know, some of them you go and you're spending $2,000 a night to stay in incredible luxury lodges. But if you go and stay there and you order like a steak or something like that, you're getting it sometimes from Norway. Like, I mean, this is not exaggeration, it's true. You're getting it from very, very far away, even though literally the threat to that park is actually from cattle ranching. So cattle ranching is happening just a few kilometers away. And in the poorest communities, this is true in South Africa, Mpumalanga province is the poorest rural province. It's mostly cattle ranching community, but it also has their primary national park, Kruger National Park. So when you talk to the communities, that you ask them, well, why do you have this antagonistic relationship with conservation? They say, well, we can't even make money from conservation. You know, we're not even able to sell our beef into the park or your goats into the park. And it turns out that the reason for that is not because the park doesn't want to buy that, is because there's no ability to butcher, there's no abattoir, there's no facility to process the meat. And because of veterinary restrictions, like for disease, in Africa you can't move cattle around. And so literally it's 6 kilometers away, but you cannot slaughter it and commercially bring it into the park. So we cracked our heads, like, should we set up a butcher shop inside the park, for example? But the solution they came up with, it was a mobile butcher shop. Basically, it's on a truck, and it's refrigerated, and it's to the highest veterinary standards, and it's a mobile abattoir. And the first time they did it, the whole thing was destroyed by a very large cow that was much bigger than the thing could handle. But they kept going on it, and now that is now an established model there. So the first time in multiple generations where the communities have actually been able to sell their produce into the park. And it's been so successful now, it's expanding to multiple countries outside of South Africa. You could never have done that without private philanthropic money. And it was pure money from, California philanthropists, to be actually honest about that. Now it's got real support. It's got much bigger ambitions of getting multilateral funding to sort of scale, right? But I love that kind of thing because that's exactly how philanthropy really should be used.
Yeah. Just a note on that, because coming from a quick service restaurant industry, the question of speed and scale is always being asked of us. And I like what Dr. Sanjay said. Are we supposed to drive the collective action, or are we really there to just create those models and link them to the economic system or link them to the policy system so that they can really achieve the scale that's needed? One thing that I think philanthropy should also focus on are institutional innovations. I like very much the earlier presented, the SEEN coalition. These kinds of changes requires ways of relating in a different manner. And if the institutions continue to persist how they work, how they behave, then the same thing will recur again and again. So how do we invest on institutional innovation, different institutional arrangements, so that organizations, communities can now interact with each other differently? That's a funding area that I think the government will not be able to do so, the private sector will not be able to do so, but it's really an area that philanthropy should consider.
Any more questions from the floor? If not, I actually have I'll put out the QR code again. So the way that the PAA is starting to look at projects is the question on exits. Eventually, philanthropic capital is limited, so we should try eventually to find a way. Either the project in the long term goes to government, it goes to a social enterprise because it's self-sustainable in terms of its funding, or it goes to a commercial enterprise. It becomes a commercial enterprise. So there's a way eventually, in order to scale, that it comes. And I like one of the slides that you had, Iqbal, about try to think about scaling right from the start of these projects. But should we also think about sustainability of the project itself? How will it get other sources of income? How will it get other ways for it to become sustainable and have the impact that continues? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there are others in this audience who are better suited to answer that question. I think my strong belief, and I'm not wearing the JPAL hat, but having worked in the field for many years before that, is that if something makes sense to the stakeholders, whether it is the farmers and and it makes sense to, and it has an impact, there will be ways to make it sustainable. I think there was a time that it was much harder to do it, but Gisela talked earlier about WhatsApp groups and others, how people organize these things. I think information travels in a way that is much, much better now. And there are many more social enterprises, many more philanthropists. Philanthropy has also become much more localized now, thanks to, again, the information spreading out. That I think the channels for things to become sustainable are greater. Now, does it mean that they all automatically self-sustain? No. I think there are multiple ways it can happen. I'm going to say selfishly from the evidence side. Part of the reason sometimes things don't become sustainable or don't get philanthropy to keep coming back is because of the skepticism. Does it really work or not? Sanjay talked about earlier that, people are far more risk averse when they're giving their money rather than when they're investing their money. And so I think one way to reduce that risk aversion is by showing them evidence that this is impactful and it is cost effective. Does it work all the time? No, but there are certain, I have worked with philanthropists that once they are convinced about that, that can certainly help. But happy to hear from others what their experience is. Please. How do you make programs self-sustaining?
Yes. I mean, we had a bit of an answer in the earlier session around nature-based solutions, for example. So could nature-based solutions and this whole idea about the carbon markets actually be a way of transferring value from one to the other? Because we also had questions around, carbon tax, for example. But if you do a tax, where does that money go to? Also, with the question, would the money go back into more sustainable practice? So you're taking money from one, but also essentially moving it to another part to ensure more sustainability, for example, for some of these projects. So there are, system questions coming to the institutional, system-wide solutions potentially that allow, in fact, this flow of capital from one side to the other in order that things get rewarded within the system as well.
Yeah. It's how do we get the different actors to now assume the role that they're supposed to play, and that will require shifting systems. Can I just add something on the role of philanthropy and PAA's role in it?
Yes, of course.
I would really very much want PAA to host a failure conference. Well, first to keep us humble, because I think there's a lot of stories there that we can learn from, and also because we need to learn fast. And because we're not talking about failures, then we're not even able to put together what it is that really would make sense. Because I honestly believe what is the role of philanthropy here. If there's anyone who should take the risk in all of this, it should not be the farmers, it should not be the teachers, it should not be the health patients. We, the philanthropy, should be able to cover the failure, the cost of failure, because it's our role. It's not for the communities to bear the burden.
It'll be the most interesting conference.
I think so. I think it's a very original.
But no one will do it.
Well, that's the challenge.
It's a great idea, but almost like no one will do it. It's a weird thing. I know exactly what you mean. I think everyone will go to it. We'd love to, wouldn't you love to hear this stuff? If you visit Unilever, not Unilever, Procter & Gamble at their headquarters. They have an entire wing that they've created a museum called the Museum of Failure of all the products they've tried in the past that didn't work. And some of them, you're going, oh my God, like, how did you, like, why would you try? Like, you know, the brand Colgate, you know, it's a toothpaste brand. They try to make like a lasagna from that brand. Oh, wow. And it's like Colgate lasagna in like red and blue. But, you know, they're very smart people. Obviously, it's a huge company, right? They get lots of things right. Yeah. But I loved it. I spent a lot of time there. And it was just incredible of them, how they were telling their story and embracing the fact that, you know, very, very smart people sometimes go down these, but it just helps you get to the right place. Yeah. It'd be a fantastic conference.
Well, JPAL, I'm sure, would have an archives already. Those, right?
We actually, we just celebrated our 20 years, and in Delhi, we did this, we created a museum. Actually, we created a museum of impact evaluations, and we actually had a room which was called Epic Failures. And unfortunately, one of the RCTs that I was involved in was also featured there. And it was not that the RCT failed, but the RCT found that this program is not impactful. Yeah. I think it's a really important question. I think people you know, try to always tell the positive stories, and failures are really, really important.
I mean, Iqbal, you get away with it because you call everything a study.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at his data, if you were the philanthropist who gave the money, it's basically like 3/4 of the money you spent failed. They made no impact at all. Like, imagine if I got that kind of money and that's my report back, I'd get creamed. Like, these people would be very upset with giving money that way.
But it's still an original idea.
It's still original idea. And I think we'll struggle finding speakers, I think, for that. So that's actually our panelists for that particular session.
And I'm sure their investment portfolio looks a little bit similar. They picked stocks which worked, and they picked stocks that failed.
The stunning thing about the investment portfolio, people will invest in all sorts of unbelievably crazy ideas. I mean, WeWorks.
Yeah.
WeWorks. Theranos. I mean, some of it's outright fraud. Some of it, would never make money. And, you know, the same guy who created WeWorks and lost all of it has now raised another few $100 million, few $100 million to do something else. I mean, it's just an amazing thing that the same people give them money over and over again. But in our kind of world, when you talk about nature or protecting climate or anything like that, this level of certainty that both investors and philanthropists want from us is kind of ridiculous. Especially given that we're working in the natural world where lots of things do go wrong.
Yeah. How many businesses actually survive? And yet we don't accept the fact that even development interventions can fail.
Right.
Yes. I guess the question of good intentions, and then good intentions, but you know, it's often you feel cheated. I guess
panel?
There is an element of emotions.
Well, perhaps you don't have to do this in an open forum, but within our community, you know, we ought to have an original dialogue with one another and says, look, this didn't work.
But then again, I mean, coming to Dr. Sanjay's point, I mean, corporates do it all the time. They actually learn from their failures and they build the institutional knowledge to improve. That is why you fail, to fail fast and to build that institutional knowledge to move forward, so that you know what your failures are and you learn and you can move ahead to the next
So if
thing.
PAA has a museum of failures, they'll credit you.
I mean, one thing was, as part of the committee's idea is to have the idea of collective funding. So you're not just funding single projects, you're funding actually a pool, a diversified pool. So that has a diversified impact as well. So you accept that within that pool there will be projects that fail, but you can learn, but there are also projects that will succeed. And the ones who succeed then are the ones then you can try to scale up across different countries, across different geographies, and you know, across different even continents. So I think this is something that PAA itself, we are very conscious that, you know, when we want to do projects, we want to look at it, the scaling question right from the start. We want to look at the sustainability question right from the start as well. Exactly. But more importantly also, we accept that not everything will succeed. And certain times, that's why we want a portfolio rather than a single project. So then we are looking at it at a portfolio basis, and we understand and have learnings across the different projects.
That's a great idea, and especially for things like carbon projects, it's the only way to go. Nature-based carbon projects, it's really the only way to go, to use a portfolio approach.
Yeah, so the USAID has a development innovations venture, DIV, which was started by the third Nobel laureate there, Michael Kremer. And so last year they actually published exactly their portfolio report. And they lost, they invested in many things which ultimately didn't work, but they invested in some things that worked. And the things that worked ended up having a 17:1, the entire portfolio, including the losses, ended up having a 17:1 return on investment, which was fantastic. This is for social development programs. So they've, like for any of you interested, just Google Michael Kremer social return on the portfolio, and you'll see the report. So what I'm saying is even the methodology is actually been built there, Donald.
Yes.
Like if PA wants to adopt that, and he's published the whole thing out there.
We'll definitely look at it. Tomorrow morning, in fact, we will have our sustainability land use workshop, where we will have a discussion around what we define as collective impact. And this will be one of the areas. What do we define collective impact, and what is collective funding also within that as well. I think I've taken enough time from the panelists as well as the audience. I thank you so much for joining us. And it's been a very rich discussion. Now, for the learnings for today, we will in fact reflect on it, and at tomorrow's workshop, we'll pull up 5 of the key learnings and then have a discussion and then have a workshop around our panel discussion today.
Great.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to the audience for their